Okay, everybody, so I'm back with part two. I am going to apologize right now that I am sorry that I didn't end that video. I got a phone call right there at the end, but what I was saying is, um, it was extremely hard for us not seeing him for 5 hours and not knowing what was going on with him. So this part of Greyson's story is the NICU. So after 5 hours of not being able to see my son or know anything about him, I was finally able to go see him down in the NICU. When I got there, it was scary because I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know if there was anything wrong with him. I didn't know if his lungs were working or, anything. I didn't know anything. And it was the hardest thing walking in and seeing what I saw. So I walk in there, and the first thing I seen is, I wish I had pictures to show you guys, an IV in his head. Now, you'd think that they would use smaller IVs on children, like in the NICU, than they would do as a human, but his IV in his head was the same size as the IV that was in my hand. So that was scary as it was, and it wasn't because of anything major. It was because he was so early, and I labored for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 hours with my water broke. They wanted to make sure they gave him antibiotics. So, and then also fluids, because we didn't know if he was going to be able to eat yet. So the first thing I saw was the IV in his head, and he was just this tiny little thing. I could cup his head in my hands. So he had, the IV, he had an NG tube, which is a tube that goes in the nose, down the esophagus, and into their stomach for feedings. They had the heart and pulse ox, and he was in an incubator. But there was no oxygen. So those steroid shots worked, and I got him just in time. His lungs were fully developed. He never had any issues breathing, and stuff like that. So that was good. And my little man weighed 4 pounds, 9 ounces, and was 18 inches long. Let's see here. In the NICU, we were having feeding issues. He was doing good, so they were able to, after I want to say 5 days, they finally took the IV out of his head, and they had it in his hand for a little bit, I think for 2 days, and then they took it out, and we were strictly feeding through his NG tube for a while. We would try with a bottle, but he wasn't getting it, and I tried to get him to latch onto my breast, because I am a firm believer in breastfeeding, and I did with my other two, and he wasn't latching onto bottles or breasts. He would sleep instead of eating. He dropped his weight down to 3 pounds and 10 ounces. So we kept the tube feeding, and we would try bottles in between. And because he was so little and we were trying to get him to gain weight, my breast milk wasn't fatty enough, so we had to mix it with formula. But I still pumped and took all of my breast milk that I could down to the NICU for him. It was stressful because next to us was this beautiful set of twin little girls that were 3 pounds when they went home, and they were there shorter than he was, and it's like, it was driving me nuts that he wasn't eating. And so in the NICU, for them to be able to come home, they have to keep their body temperature right while eating. They have to take all their feedings at their scheduled times with no spit ups. they have to pass a car seat test, which is where they sit your baby in a car seat for an hour and monitor their heart rate and stuff like that. So, he hated his tube feed, and I felt so bad because he would always reach up and he would rip it out, and that went on almost every day. He was ripping it out and they'd have to replace it, and which was getting hard on his throat and his nasal cavity because, you know, constant putting stuff down through there, it's rubbing you raw. So, and while tube feeding, while you're trying to get them the bottle feed, they leave the tube in. So, just in case they don't finish their bottle, they can finish putting it through in the tube, but they have to finish it from a bottle. And you have to have, I think it was 8 or 10 bottles in 24 hours they had to keep down for them to be approved to go home. Now, they could take all their feedings and then at that last hour not take that last one, and you'd have to start all over again. But during this process of trying to get him to eat and latch onto his bottles, which you could tell he was struggling, but they couldn't figure out why he was struggling with it. And so, at the time, he was moved to a crib or a bassinet, and he was able to wear clothes. He was under lights for jaundice for a couple days. And he passed his car seat test. So it was just a matter of him taking his food, and it was just so frustrating because, you know, they tell us, hey, get ready, he's coming home tomorrow, and then the next morning you go in there to get him and they're like, oh, well, he didn't take his last feeding, so, you know, this and that. So I got frustrated, and I live an hour away from the hospital, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to stay here all night, and I'm going to make sure that he gets all of his feedings. And finally, he was able to take his feedings, and I was so excited because we were finally able to bring him home. He was sent home on a high-calorie diet and a very strict feeding schedule. He came home at 5 pounds. And he had to have weigh-ins every week up until he was 5 months old. So that is part 2 of Greyson's story, and he was in the NICU for 19 days. So I will see you guys in the next video.